Hello, ELIC 30. This is Michael, and we are in How to Be Human, An Autistic Man's Guide to Life by Jory Fleming with Lyric Winnick. We're starting chapter 5 today, which is on page 101. But before I begin in the chapter, I just want to make a brief comment on something that that Jory said on the previous page, on page 99, on page 100, where he talks about this book, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I actually had at one time 2 copies of that very book on my bookshelf. It's considered a very important book, very historically significant. It's also probably the first book on economics. And today there's a whole field of study called economics. But in Adam Smith's day, there was not. And so people didn't really have a firm understanding of why prices went up or why prices went down, or the relationship between supply and demand. I'm a manufacturer and I make 1,000 pairs of shoes. I should be rich, but I'm not. Why not? Well, could it be because I'm making too many shoes? And the same thing is true with grain prices. If there's a lot of grain, if there's too much grain so that people aren't buying it, the prices go down, but the cost to the farmer does not go down. His prices, he still has to pay for his labor and for all of his materials that he uses to grow his product. So anyway, The Wealth of Nations addresses those things, and it was written about 200 years ago. So the writing style is a little bit old, and he's writing about economics. And yeah, it's really, to a modern reader, it's not pleasure reading. So I'm not recommending this as a fun novel to read for recreation. But it is still in print. You can buy brand new copies, brand new prints of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So I just thought I should make some brief comment about that, since Jory gave that as an example. Now, beginning chapter 5, Language Barriers. Talking about language. Decades of research have taught scientists that there is no single language spot inside the brain, but rather a complex circuitry that allows humans to express themselves through words. There are documented cases of people who have one form of aphasia, the medical term for language impairment, where they struggle to speak, versus another form where they string together long but highly random assortments of words. Brain researchers have postulated that most speech functions are primarily performed by 2 regions: Broca's area, discovered in 1861 by a French surgeon, Paul Broca, and Wernicke's area, named for German medical scholar Karl Wernicke, who identified it in 1874. To learn how to speak, infants and toddlers have to activate and connect these 2 main speech areas through a complex pathway of neurons. This process explains why babies can't speak and initially can't understand much of substance when someone speaks to them. But that is hardly the end of the brain's language complexity. As with much of brain study, injury and affliction have provided the best maps of how volatile and complicated the connections are. There are stroke and brain injury victims who can recall nouns and not verbs, others who can hardly speak but have no trouble singing, and still others who can write sentences but cannot read them. For children on the autistic spectrum, language delay is a frequent struggle, and conversely, language delays are often used as an early indicator of some type of autism. Two researchers, Catherine Wan and Gottfried Schlag, have suggested trying to rethink autism by viewing it as a disorder of connections between brain regions. They add that autistic language deficits may be due to problems integrating different brain functions, rather than with any impairment of these individual brain areas themselves. This very brief tour of linguistic brain science provides a backdrop to Jory's descriptions of his own language struggles and how he eventually mastered the ability to communicate through speech. Okay, pause. What does the author mean by backdrop? Well, in drama, in theater, if you ever go to a play or to an opera or something, you see there's this screen behind the actors, and it's painted a certain way. If the story takes place in a forest, you have a picture of a forest scene on the backdrop. Or if it's a city scene, you have a picture of a city landscape on the backdrop. So the backdrop is the part behind the actors that helps the audience understand the context of the action that is taking place. The backdrop that you're seeing behind me is really not a very good backdrop at all. It's just a whiteboard, so it doesn't tell you much of anything. But I thought I should pause and just explain this use of the backdrop. Continuing on. As his mother, Kelly, noted, when Jory began to speak, he often strung together words and phrases in ways that made no sense, or made no sense in context, such as asking to hear music by saying, "It's a cold night." Jory's brain had latched on to those words as being connected to music. Jory begins by explaining why he sees language as a fundamental obstacle for him when it comes to communication. Jory: a person who can walk might not even think about a tiny step because they don't notice it. They don't have to take a large step up a stair. But for someone in a wheelchair, that bump is enough height to make an entrance inaccessible. I feel like people are usually surprised by that. Whereas, if somebody were to ask me that, I wouldn't say that a route is accessible unless I distinctly visualize the entire route. And in most cases, I would re-walk it and check. I wouldn't just assume. Buildings are constructed by society, and the fact that people who are atypical have problems with something that they did not construct should surprise no one. For me, it's not steps or buildings, but language that gives me the most trouble. Part of the reason why I find language so difficult is because there is no alternative. If there was an alternative, and perhaps other people were using it, I might be significantly better at communicating. And in particular, I'd be less likely to be misunderstood. I am always concerned about that. I try my best, but I also realize that many times I'm going to be tremendously irritated because there will be instances where I can't say something without it being misinterpreted, or I say something and it will be misinterpreted, and there's no way for me to correct it besides saying, "That's not what I meant at all," which is challenging, especially if everybody interprets it the same way. Then they'll be suspicious and distrust me when I say that wasn't what I meant. In some sense, language is continually being recreated, and most people think that's fine. There's not even any questioning of it by the larger society. But for me, those changes are like the small step no one notices. Then everyone else thinks I am wrong when I get stopped by the step. LW. What would your ideal communication system be? Jory. If I could create a default communication system for my little circular world, it might be telepathy, something where you could instantly mind sync with anybody and just pop in and out and go everywhere and nowhere. But it's very hard to think about because it's not ever going to happen. If someone invented telepathy, it would probably be based on language. If I have trouble existing in everybody else's system, I guarantee everybody else would hate whatever system I might come up with. It would be terrible for everyone except me, and maybe other people with autism. In my system, neurotypical people won't know how to communicate or translate what's going on in their mind and what's going on in the outside world. They wouldn't think it's stable. They'd think it's very chaotic. Nothing makes sense and everything's very meaningless. It wouldn't solve the problem. It would be all the problems that I have, but in reverse for people without autism. The parts of language that are good shouldn't be changed just because I have difficulty with some of them. That's my personal opinion. I know that's not going to apply to everyone who feels a disconnect with language. And certainly, that same kind of logic doesn't hold for other social issues where people are disadvantaged or are excluded. But in my case, I think it's fine. Yes, it leads to difficulties, but I don't think that's a problem because while I have a lot of difficulties and challenges, if I was offered the opportunity to swap to be like everyone else, I don't think I would. It's a trade-off that I am willing to accept. And we'll stop there for now.